shows us, and the scholarship on it shows that when people are identifying as conservative on this measure, that is a fairly strong predictor of their partisanship, right? So that should be kind of correlated very strongly with ideological leanings to conservative and their partisanship. For African Americans, it doesn't. And I think for African Americans, ideology is not as meaningful in the same capacity as the group identification and the group interest and the understanding of the political norms, which ties to partisanship. So in this case, ideological diversity can exist, but the partisan norm is what is the standout, right? Which is really what is serving as the way in which one is going to engage in politics. So I think they have an understanding of what conservative ideology means, but it doesn't necessarily go one-to-one with partisanship, because partisanship for the group is a completely different understanding that I think we traditionally see from other groups who participate.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm asking because I'm not even sure what constitutes conservative anymore. And it seems to me that, well, I mean, honestly, can you tell me what set of policies are associated with conservatism? And for me, if I was really pressed at this point, the only thing I would say would be a certain amount of, being anti-choice, maybe also having some measure of LGBTQ prejudice, and then really it's in this day and age, it's whatever Donald Trump says it is. I mean, and a certain amount of of white supremacy that may not be obviously articulated in that way. But that's why I'm sort of fascinated by what, if you have a sense as to when an African American says that my ideology is conservative. I mean, what does that mean? I really don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? In our book, we tried to actually assess it, keeping in mind that the measure that we typically use basically asks people to put themselves on an ideological scale of liberal to conservative. So it doesn't actually define it for them. So then we had to think about, okay, well, what other ways can we tap into conservatives? Because I think you're right. There is an association now with conservatism that has gone to a much more polarized space than we had seen before. And African Americans, conservatism could be anything for that community to be, for instance, somebody who religiously is conservative, like religiosity, because African Americans as a racial group are some of the strongest, participants within the Christian faith, right? And so that could be identifying as conservatism, but it's not specifically explained in that question. So we looked at other measures, and so some of the things where we see some indicators of African Americans who are conservative has to do with government guaranteeing jobs and income, support for government health insurance plans, government action to help the poor, government reducing income differences between the rich and the poor, and seeing more conservative leaning on that, looking at how the government should do what government should do to try to improve standards for African Americans. We're seeing more conservative leaning on that question, saying that the government shouldn't intervene. So a lot of the questions that we tried to tap into were related to central government intervention into issues of equity going on. And do we see more African Americans leaning in favor of that or against that? And how has that shifted over time? And so that's what we have seen and observed in the data. But I agree with you. The conservative moniker and the label itself is fraught, completely fraught, and very polarized with the environment. And I think African Americans would potentially identify as conservative, but really because partisanship and the social engagement around partisanship serves to be one of the largest things in terms of how they engage politically, is really where they are going to be the most likely to make sure that they are in alignment with where the group is expecting them to be.
All right. Well, so let's talk about that sort of notion of the group and of these social constraints. There, you have some really, you've recounted some really fascinating, sort of studies that manifest this. But explain to us the thesis. Well, and you've sort of hinted at it on some level that there is that these varying different, factors are outweighed ultimately in certain circumstances when it comes to Black voters making a choice.
Absolutely, right. And I think kind of like the key takeaway from our book is that Black partisanship is maintained through Black social networks. And so when we are looking at Democratic partisanship over the last several decades, we need to understand that although you have these things that have changed the diversity and the political diversity of the community and even economically, that over time we continue to see this Democratic Party norm, especially when it comes to like presidential elections, and that we see that start to get formulated in this way, or at least kind of manifesting in this way when it comes to Democratic partisanship in the civil rights movement, right, and the consolidation at that time. And a lot of that has to do with the civil rights legislation that is passed at that time, and also the avenue for even being able to participate in politics electorally and even in representation happening for African Americans through the Democratic Party. And through that, a norm, we argue in the book, is established and a norm is maintained and reinforced for the community that basically is the understanding that to be Black is to be Democrat, and supporting this norm of Black partisanship is important for the group, and it is expected by individuals that they do that as members of the group, right? And it's understood that that is what one should do, that this is the best way for the group to achieve the goals of political advancement and opportunity and equity is if we do this, right? And that this norm goes back historically, that we can see norms of collective action and behavior going on for African Americans all the way back to slavery, right? When it comes to abolitionist movements, efforts to try to escape plantations, which we talk about in the book, as well as during the periods after slavery when Black African Americans were part of the Republican Party in mass, that all of those attempts and efforts are done as a collective means to try to make sure that African Americans have voice in the system. And it's a majority-based system. So when you're a minority group, this is going to be the effective way of doing that. And we argue that the ability for this norm to maintain itself over time has a lot to do with racial segregation, right? That African Americans are in communities that are predominantly, if not all Black, are dealing with day-to-day interactions that are predominantly, if not all Black. And the norm of political participation is clearly understood, right? And so that then leads to an en masse behavior that we've observed where African Americans participate in politics this way because there's an understanding that this is just what we do. This is how we do this. And so in the book, we try to examine this by looking at ways that we can measure the social constraint behavior. Essentially, can we show instances in which an individual is being asked by an African American, or they are dealing with the interaction with another African American versus somebody who's non-Black, or even in the absence of anybody, and show that there is some sort of pressure that people understand that leads to this partisan behavior. And we argue that this type of socialized behavior is important to understand because this then gets at the diversity component of political and economics within the Black community, that African Americans who have motivations that potentially could lead them to voting for the Republican Party, right, like self-interest motivations economically, they may be very well off. Politically, they may be people who lean conservative, like the way you defined conservative often is viewed. And yet we don't see that happening in large numbers. And we argue that constraint, that they feel restrained in doing that. And those who feel more comfortable potentially going against the norm that's understood are individuals who aren't going to be dealing with that social aspect as much. In fact, those people are probably in fairly racially diverse social networks that allow for those ideological views potentially to manifest into their partisan behavior. So that's kind of a summing up of the book there. But I mean, essentially, this is what we're thinking about. That is a social process. And if you want a group to participate in a collective behavior in a majority system as a minority group, that one way to do that is to basically behave in this way. And in order for people to do it and know that that's something to be done, that there also needs to be some repercussions for people who decide not to. And that's where we talk about this idea of social sanctions, essentially people getting reprimanded by the group openly for deciding to basically go away from the understood norm, which is voting for the Democratic Party and doing something else. And we've seen that happen. Kanye West was like one of the most popular examples, right. Steve Harvey. But in all of our studies, we're trying to really examine that.
Okay, so and I want to walk sort of back through that, and certainly I want to talk about one or two of the big studies because they're sort of fascinating manifestations of this. But to be clear, the social constraint, I mean, you're talking about sort of like how it operates, how it's enforced. I just want to talk for a moment about the impetus. The impetus is that there are a fundamental set of transcending issues that impact everyone who, I mean, this is the impetus for the constraint. There is a fundamental set of transcendent issues that impact Black people, regardless of their religiosity, regardless of their how much money they make, for the most part. I mean, across the board, right? That's the argument. Is that, or is that even part of it? I mean, how much of that is just simply a function of, look, the bottom line is, we're going to do better on some very fundamental, basic rights issues with Democrats than we will with the Republicans. Is that basically what that sort of first building block of that social constraint is?
I think so. It has both of those components to it, right? So I think one of the building blocks for sure has to do with what issues are directly affecting African Americans, right? And the long history of race being so defining to the Black lived experience, and that has been foundational, right, to how America has been designed, to our politics, to our institutions, and to your day-to-day interactions and lived circumstances, right? So foundationally, right, as a group, it has become understood that individually trying to achieve uplift becomes an issue, right? That it is not enough because race becomes so defining. So collectively, it is understood then that in order for individuals to basically make moves ahead, right, the group itself also has to be able to do so, right? That individually, you're always going to fall back into the race issue, right? And that's regardless of kind of how much you've succeeded or even moved up or had economic success or had particular things happen for you. And so that is going to be very shaping to that. I think the understanding then of the two parties is that over time, especially in this contemporary period, that the Democratic Party has become seen and viewed as the party that would allow for more advancement for the group, not only from the legislation and in the policy that has been passed when those individuals have been in power, but additionally that most of the Black elected officials that we even see now in office and have come to power through the Democratic Party, right? So the opportunities for the realization of Black political involvement, not only through the voting aspect, but actually elected office and officials, has occurred through the Democratic Party. So they are viewed as the one that is going to be the most likely to speak to these group interests relative to the Republican Party, right? So it is very pro-partisan behavior. I think sometimes we get asked, is it anti-Republican? Like Republicans have done racist things in the history, Southern strategies, certain time periods after the radical Republican period, after slavery. But it's a pro-social, it's a pro-partisan behavior, right? It is an idea that this particular party is going to be the one that best embodies what is needed for the group to be able to achieve some of the equity and equality that it wants.
Okay, I want to put a pin in that specific thing because that has implications as to whether people are, how people are going to come out. I mean, because when we talk about the primary, right, it was not a we've described that vote, at least in part, as a negative partisanship vote in some way, right? That the driving force of supporting Joe Biden was obviously in part like, okay, I'm simpatico with him politically, but the other driving force was this is the guy who's going to beat Donald Trump. I mean, it was a vote for Joe Biden more often than not. I mean, this is true of all Democrats, across the board, was a vote against Donald Trump in some way, or was driven by that. So how do you?
It has some drive.
I mean, how do you?
It is driven some part by that. Yes.
Okay. Well, we'll swing back around, because I also want to ask about. I mean, ultimately get to, the Obama to no one voters and those type of folks in 2016. But before we get there.